The most important piece of imagery in the entirety of Dark Souls is ironically the first few moments of the game. The cell. Cells, cages, and prison. They're synonymous in our culture with crime and punishment, and even further back, slavery. Philosophically speaking, it's as low as you can get. The lowest point of a human life exists in solitary confinement, barricaded and locked up. This is why the pacing of Dark Souls' early game feels so captivating. Sprawled out on the dark and wet floor of that prison cell, the opening scene represents starting out at the lowest point of humanity. You are suddenly rescued by Oscar, Knight of Astora, who pushes a corpse down into your cell, bearing a key that will secure your escape. Oscar, like you, is undead and is close to going hollow, so he selects you to continue his pilgrimage. Opening up the rickety cell door and stepping outside, the only way is up. Every step forward is an act of ascension. You're climbing past the asylum demon to the top of the bridge to fight the tourist demon. You're scaling even higher towards the mysterious bird that will clutch you in its talons and fly you to your temporary safe haven at Firelink Shrine. And of course you're climbing even higher through the undead burg to confront the bell gargoyles at the top of the cathedral. And even still, you climb even further towards your destination of the first Bell of Awakening, with the camera panning out so that you may see the fruits of your efforts far below you. This is one of the apex moments of pacing in Dark Souls. You feel accomplished, the souls of the enemies whom you've defeated littering the spaces below you. It's an overlooked pinnacle of Dark Souls, this traversal of verticality from the lowest of the low to one of the higher points in Lordran. Imagine the first time you experienced this moment, for the very first time. It had some weight behind it because our consciousness is aware that a change in elevation occurred, whether that distance is measured in physical footsteps or the growth of our own mentality. This would all feel much different if the player started out at a geographical elevation that was equal to or higher with the elevation of that first Bell of Awakening. Our culture reminds us that the best things in life are those we strive for, we work towards, and pursue. Pursuit is most certainly analogous with reaching for something, and when you reach for something, you're usually reaching out and upwards, and move in that action. Think about the story of Rapunzel, the woman locked in a cage and set at the top of a tall castle with no way out. Rapunzel's escape was an act of descension, unlike our hero in Dark Souls. Escape is usually associated with running away from something, not toward it. Rapunzel ran away from confinement. Prisoners run away from guards. We are taught to run from what pursues us. In Dark Souls, you run towards things that have confined you. It all feels like an act of pursuit rather than escape. Of course, this is a video game, but the bottom line remains. Dark Souls wants you to confront. The first few hours of the game, when analyzed together like this, really summarize one of the critical sections of the game. Past the gargoyles, most of the game forward has you plunging in the opposite direction. Down, way down, down into the darkness and unseen horror. It's with certain confidence I can say that Dark Souls was designed in such a manner. Most players will find themselves heading towards Lower Undead Burg and the depths directly after defeating the gargoyles. This leaves zero breathing room and eliminates the chance for a player's emotional state to return to equilibrium after such a constant upward trajectory. This is where I feel Dark Souls really nails it with the early game in terms of emotional pacing. You've defeated the gargoyles on that mighty rooftop. You've climbed, you've fought, struggled, and you've rung the first Bell of Awakening. But there's no rest for the wicked in Dark Souls. The next few hours of the game exist immediately for the sole purpose of awakening a newfound sense of dread, and that is to plunge downward into blackness. Blighttown, most notable in the series for being one of the most wretched areas in existence, marks the cornerstone for this juxtaposition. As a first-time player, Blighttown is just a big nightmare, let's be honest here. Not only is it difficult to get your mind wrapped around where you're at usually, but it's also entombed in geographical ambiguity. Ladders leading upwards, ladders leading downwards, and even horizontal ladder bridges defying the laws of gravity. Endless swarms of flying enemies, toxic darts being shot out from the darkness at all corners around you, and more than your fair share of chances to fall to your death. It's all stemmed in this very cathedral-like atmosphere too. You feel like you're up so high at some points, and yet centralized in a giant cave that you can barely see. It's got this weird effect that makes you feel very claustrophobic on one hand, but very isolated on the other, like you're a small fish in a big black pond. But in lieu of that, your fate draws you to the very bottom of Blighttown for your inevitable duel with a Chaos Witch Quelaag. Dark Souls feels very centralized in theme when you complete Blighttown and make your way back to Firelink Shrine, the journey from the beginning of the game to the first Bell Awakening as a direct and thematic counterpoint to the journey from Firelink Shrine to the second Bell of Awakening. Although each portion of the game is very direct and focused, the linear journey from point A to point B, the geographical verticality moves in perfect opposites. Obviously the game opens up so much more after you ring that second Bell of Awakening, but the path to the end of the game seems much more annular and much more freeform at the same time once you do that. You've got options to hit up the Valley of the Drakes, Darkroot Garden, New Londo, and of course there is the inevitable run through Sen's Fortress, the Catacombs, and various other areas. But these areas never feel as linear and vertical as the areas before you run both Bells of Awakening. They're more self-centralized loops where you'll be circumventing square footage more so on a planular scale. Many of those areas, including and especially Anor Londo and the Duke's Archives, feel like they could be expanded upon and made into whole worlds themselves. It's easy to jump into those zones and walk around for hours getting adjusted to their game space, which puts them in stark contrast to the otherwise very vertical and direct path you've been previously taken on during the Bells of Awakening. It's this differentiation that I believe is interesting to look at when analyzing Dark Souls or any other successful game. How a world is built is important, but I could argue that the pacing, the journey through the world and how and when you interact with it, is even more critical to the total experience. And Dark Souls really nails it, giving us a lot of fantastic space to experience a variety of emotions while being paced through some very interesting and different gameplay sections. Dark Souls is a very dark game, but at the end of its tunnel is a very bright potential for interesting topics and discussions that are relevant today. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to Downward Thrust now because more Souls content will be coming very soon. And thanks for watching. Have a kick-ass day, guys.